Welcome to Trade Signal. You're watching a lesson on configuring password policies. Now this lesson is going to be a fairly short and to the point lesson, but at the same time a very important lesson because this deals with passwords and therefore it deals with security. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by seeing how password policies affect our global Mantics organization. Then we're going to talk about the actual password policy itself and go through each of the different settings and make sure we understand exactly what they all mean. We'll do the same thing for something called the account lockout policy, which works hand in hand with the password policy. Then we'll jump into the operating system and I'll show you how to set it all up. And I'll show you a couple different ways to do it. One way using the default domain policy, which is kind of the older way or the original way of doing it. And then I'm going to show you something that's new to Windows Server 2008, which is where we can use something called a password settings object. Now, Global Mantics, similar to many other organizations out there, would like to have different rules when it comes to the level of password complexity required for different users throughout the organization. This has always been a problem throughout the years, that different users work in a different security capacity. Okay, some users don't do very much on the network, and then other users, like maybe our IT administrators, work on a much higher level of security, and so therefore we want to have much stronger passwords for them. Well, in previous versions of Active Directory, this could only be done by separating these users into different domains. Now, that might sound a little crazy to you, and if it does, well, you're right. It is just absolutely crazy to think about the fact that you have to create a whole new domain just to meet a separate level of password complexity requirements. And so fortunately, in Windows Server 2008 R2, and I will tell you, even in the original version of Server 2008, this was true as well, we no longer have to separate into the different domains. We now have, as I said, I'm going to show you, these things called password settings object, which allow us to use what's called a fine-grained password policy to where we can allocate different password requirements to different users and groups within a domain. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the different ways to set up these password policies. Now, when it comes to the actual password policy, there are 6 different settings involved. The first setting is enforce password history. Now, this has to do with the system not allowing a user to reuse the same password that they've used X number of times. So as a for instance, if we were to set that particular setting to a value of, let's say, 6, well, that means that the user, when they're changing their password, they cannot use the same password as the last 6 passwords that they've used. Now, this may or may not make sense as to why we do this when we look at the one setting by itself, but once we put all the settings together, I think it'll make a little more sense. So let's look at the second one here, maximum password age. Now, this is probably one of the most obvious settings, which is, after X number of days, a user has to reset their password. Okay, so if I set the maximum password age to 30, then that means 30 days after a user has had a password, they will be forced to change it to a different password. Now, along those same lines, when they are forced to change it to a different password, if we are enforcing a certain level of password history, they will have to change it to a password that they haven't used before, or at least in the last X number of tries. So if we continue with the scenario of saying the password history set at 6 and the maximum password age is 30, then every 30 days they're going to have to change their password, and they can't use the same password that they've used for, well, approximately the last 6 months or so. Now, there is a little trick to this to where a user, if we only put those 2 settings, a user could actually get an old password back. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. And it has to do with the third setting, which is minimum password age. Now, this setting confuses a lot of people. Why would you have to have a minimum password age? In other words, once you've reset your password, okay, so you've changed your password to ABC123, and I'm going to say you have to keep that password for 3 days. Okay, just to put a number out there, let's say the minimum password age was 3 days. Why would I force somebody to have to keep a password for 3 days? Well, it has to do with what users might try to do if we only use the first two settings. If we go ahead and say a user must reset their password every 30 days, and users don't like resetting their passwords, right? They get used to a certain password and they just want to keep it forever. So we tell them they then have to reset their password. Well, they'll just reset it to the same password. But then we enforce password history, which says, well, you can't use the same password that you've used the last 6 times. Oh, okay. Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change my password. And then as soon as I change it again. And then I change it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, until I've set up 6 bogus passwords that I don't care about. And then I can change it one more time to the 7th change, which means I can go back to my original password. This is why we have a minimum password age. If I force users to have to keep their password for 3 days before they can change it again, well, then they could still go ahead and get their original password back, but they'd have to wait 18 days basically, right? They'd have to have 3 days and then go to another password for 3 days and another password for 3 days for those 6 bogus passwords. And then finally, they could go back to their original password that they like. But they're only going to keep that one for 30 days, and then they have to go through that 18-day headache again. So guess what? That one small deterrent is enough to stop users from trying to go back to a password that they like to have. Now, the one other side note that I'm going to tell you is if a user was to set their password and the 3 days has not passed, and they want to change it, whether it be they think somebody else has figured it out or they have forgotten it or whatever, they can still call into an IT administrator who can then reset their password for them. Okay, so that can be overridden, but only by an administrator, not by an end user. Now, the 4th setting is pretty obvious: minimum password length. And it means just that. How long must the password be? If we say the minimum length is 6 characters, well, then they must set their password to at least 6 characters. If I say the minimum password length is 15 characters, well, then they must make their passwords at least 15 characters long. Now, the 5th setting we have here is password must meet complexity requirements. If a password must meet complexity requirements, and this is pretty much either enabled or disabled, if it's enabled, then a password must contain at least 3 out of 4 different character types. Now, the 4 different character types would be uppercase letters, so that's 1, lowercase letters, that's 2, numbers, that's 3, and other characters or non-alphanumeric symbols, such as maybe the pound sign or an exclamation mark or an ampersand, things like that. Those are the 4 different character types, and if password must meet complexity requirements is enabled, then the password must have at least 3 out of those 4. Now, the last setting that we have here is one that I don't recommend that you use unless you absolutely have to, and that is store passwords using reversible encryption. See, by default, what is stored is something called a hash of the password. And a hash, without getting into a whole cryptography lesson here, a hash is a one-way, non-reversible encryption code. And this is done so that if somebody were to hack into the system and then try to decrypt the password files, they wouldn't be able to do it because it's a one-way encryption. You cannot decrypt it. But the problem is that sometimes there are applications that have to have the ability to read a user's password. If you have this situation, then you're going to be left with no choice but to go ahead and store the passwords using a reversible encryption so that you still have some level of security because the passwords are encrypted, but then the applications can decrypt them, which also means that an attacker who hacks into your network could also potentially decrypt and figure out your passwords. Now, the other type of policy that I want to talk to you about is something called the account lockout policy. The account lockout policy as a whole, I will tell you, has to do with preventing people from trying to guess users' passwords. Okay, the concept of account lockout is if somebody were to sit down at a computer and just start guessing at one of the user's passwords, after a certain number of incorrect guesses, the account gets locked out. And so these three settings we have here is what controls that account lockout. Now I'm going to actually jump to the middle setting first. Okay, the one that's called the account lockout threshold. The account lockout threshold is that X that I just used a few minutes ago. When I say somebody sits down and does the wrong password X number of times, well, that X is the account lockout threshold. So if we set that at 3, then that means if somebody guesses the wrong password 3 times in a row, the account gets locked out. Now, once the account gets locked out, the account lockout duration setting, which is the first setting on the list, this is the setting that controls how long the account is locked out. Okay, and there's two different approaches to this. One is you can put an actual timer on it. So we could say, all right, somebody sits down, puts the wrong password in 3 times, so the account's been locked out. Let's make that account sit locked out for 15 minutes, and then we'll unlock the account automatically. Okay, that way, if an account ever gets locked out, a user doesn't necessarily have to call in to help desk to have somebody reset that account. All they have to do is wait 15 minutes. Or maybe it's not the actual user, right? Somebody else is guessing at the passwords. They got the account locked out. Well, maybe the user isn't even in the office at that moment. And by the time the user gets back to the office, well, the account has been released. Now, if you're thinking, that doesn't sound very safe, we're not really preventing, well, we are. Okay, similar to what I was talking about in the previous settings with the minimum password age being a deterrent, enough of a deterrent anyway to stop people from bothering. Well, if we were to have an account locked out for 15 minutes and then release it, that's enough of a deterrent that if somebody's going to be password guessing, what are they going to do? Sit down and try 3 passwords, wait 15 minutes, try 3 more, wait 15 minutes, try 3 more? It would take them a very long time to sit down and eventually guess somebody's password. Now, if you truly think that that is not secure enough for your environment, you can set the account lockout duration to permanently stay locked out until an administrator releases the account. Okay, so that is an option. You could go ahead and say, after 3 wrong guesses, lock the account, and once it's been locked out, only an administrator can then unlock it. You can do that. And that might not be a bad idea, especially if you are suspicious that this might be happening, because then, as an administrator, although you're bothered with the fact that somebody's calling and asking you to unlock their account, you can keep track of whose account is getting locked out and how often, and it might tell you a little something about where a certain attack might be taking place. Now, the third setting here is reset account lockout counter after. Now, this has to do with how long before the counter resets. And the counter that we're referring to is when we talk about the account lockout threshold, when we say that there has to be 3 invalid attempts, well, we have the ability to say, all right, so let's say they did 2 invalid attempts. But we don't want to just leave it hanging out there with 2 invalid attempts, and then if the real user were to sit down and accidentally make a typo one time, boom, they're locked out. So what you can do is you can say, all right, if a certain amount of time has passed, start counting all over again. Go back down to 0. We're going to pretend like there's been no invalid passwords. So we might say that the account lockout counter can be reset after 10 minutes or 15 minutes as well. And again, if the user wants to sit down and try, maybe somebody's trying to guess someone's password and they don't want it to be known that they're doing this guessing, so they try 2 passwords. That stops them from getting the account locked out, right? That way they're maybe not suspected, but then they got to wait 10, 15 minutes, and then 2 passwords, and 10, 15 minutes, and 2 passwords, 10, 15 minutes. You see where I'm going with this? So that's what the account lockout policy is. All right, enough talking about it. Let's jump over to the operating system and let's see exactly how this all works. So here I am on our Windows 7 client in the Global Mantics domain. And the first way that I'm going to show you how to set up a password policy is through group policy, which has to be done using the Group Policy Management Console, which is available either on our domain controllers or, as you've seen in previous lessons, if you install the remote server administration tools, which we've done here, we can add group policy management where we can just click on Start, Administrative Tools, Group Policy Management. Now here in Group Policy Management, I will tell you that in all previous versions of Windows Server, you had to set up these policies in a group policy linked to the domain. Matter of fact, I will tell you that even in Windows Server 2008, you have to link a group policy that has password policy settings to the domain. If you were to link a group policy with password policy settings to an organizational unit, those settings would not apply. Now, after I show you how to do this through group policy, I will show you how we can set up password policy settings for individual users and groups, but it's a little bit different. It's not through group policy. So the first thing we want to do here is go to the default domain policy. And really, it could be any policy, but it has to be linked to the domain. So since we have this policy linked to the domain, let's right-click and select Edit. Under Computer Configuration, we're going to expand Policies. And then we expand Windows Settings. And then we're going to expand Security Settings. And I'll tell you what, before I do that, let me maximize this and move this bar over so we can see what we're doing. So I'm going to expand Security Settings. And then I'm going to expand Account Policies. And then here's where you'll see the password policy. When I click on Password Policy, you can see here are the 6 settings that we just talked about a little while ago. You'll see that the default, because I haven't touched anything here, this is just how it comes installed with Active Directory, is that it enforces password history. 24 passwords are remembered. Okay, so we're going to remember the last 24 passwords. A user cannot use the same password that they've used the last 24 times. So what that essentially means is they're just going to always use something new. The maximum password age is 42 days. So that would be 6 weeks. The minimum password age is 1 day. Okay, so basically, look what we have going on. Every 42 days or every 6 weeks, a user has to change their password. They can't use the same password that they've used the last 24 times. And once they've changed their password, they must keep it for at least 1 day. So if they want, for 24 consecutive days, they could change their password, and then on the 25th day, go back to their original password, but then 6 weeks later, they got to go through that process again. So users just aren't going to do it. From there, we have our minimum password length of 7 characters. Password complexity is enabled, and we are not storing passwords with reversible encryption. Now, if we want to change any of these, all we do is just double-click on the setting. And if we say, all right, well, we don't want to keep 24 passwords, let's say we were only going to do 6, like I had mentioned earlier. And let's say for maximum password age, well, since we're only going to hang on to 6, well, we also are going to be a little bit more forceful on the how often they have to reset. We're going to say every 30 days they have to reset. And once they have it, we're going to say they have to keep it for 3 days. We're going to set a minimum password length of 8 characters. And as far as complexity requirements, we will go ahead and leave that enabled. If I click on the Explain tab, I just want to show you here that there's a little bit more to the complexity requirements than what I mentioned earlier. See, what I mentioned is what's most typically thought of, is that you must have characters from 3 of the following 4 categories. Okay, where you can have uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and non-alphabetic characters. Okay, those are what we typically think of. But technically, you also cannot contain the user's account name or part of the user's full name that exceeds 2 consecutive characters. Okay, so this prevents John Smith from having a password of John123 or Smith123 or something like that. Okay, so the user's name can't be included. It also must be at least 6 characters in length, although that typically is also going to be in place through the previous setting if you are enabling password complexity. Okay, in other words, let me go ahead and cancel out of here. If you are working in an organization where password must meet complexity requirements, it's rare that you wouldn't already have a minimum password length of 6 characters or greater. But if you didn't, technically, this one covers it. This one makes you go to 6 characters. Okay, so that's the full explanation of what complexity means. Must be at least 6 characters, cannot include the user's name, and must have 3 out of the 4 character types. Now that's how you would set a password policy at the domain level. Now the account lockout policy is right below it, and here's our 3 settings. And again, our account lockout threshold, let's start there. By default, you'll see that it's set to 0, meaning we're not actually doing account lockout. So let's go ahead and change this. By the way, before I change it, notice it says account will not lock out. When you set it to 0, the account will never lock out. Let's change it to 3 invalid logon attempts. You'll notice this changed to account will lock out after 3 invalid logon attempts. And now this is something that is kind of interesting, and this happens with other policies, like even the password policy will do this sometimes as well. If you have not defined other settings that correspond with the setting that you just set, it will make some recommendations to you. So it's actually suggesting, it's saying, well, you know, you've gone ahead and set that you want to start locking the account out, but you haven't set an account lockout duration or how often to reset the lockout counter. So it's recommending, how about we do 30 minutes for each? Now I'll go ahead and click OK, just so I can show you it changed both of those to 30 minutes. But if I don't like those, I could go ahead and change it. I could say, no, you know what? I only need it locked out for 15. That's long enough. And then again, here it says resetting the account lockout counter for 30 minutes doesn't make sense if the lockout duration is only 15. So they say, how about you change that one to 15? Yeah, okay, that sounds good. Matter of fact, you know what? We'll even say that account lockout counter, we'll even set that one down to 10 minutes. Okay, and there is no one specific magical set of numbers that is the correct numbers to use. I'm just using some hypothetical numbers. These are numbers that I've seen used in real-world production environments. Okay, and that's how you would set the account lockout policy through group policy. Both of these must be done at the domain level. Okay, so if I close out of here and close out of here, now users will be expected to reset their passwords every 30 days. They can't use the same password they've used the last 6 times. Once they've set it, they must keep it for 3 days, must be at least 8 characters long, and must meet complexity requirements. And as far as account lockout, if you try the wrong password 3 times within a 10-minute window, then the account's going to get locked out, and it's going to stay locked out for 15 minutes. Now, let's go ahead and take a quick look at something here. Let's go ahead and switch over to Active Directory, Users and Computers. And let's just go ahead and pick on a user. So let's go into the sales department. And we're going to go with, let's see here, Edwin Bryant. Okay, and I'm going to actually, let's reset Edwin's password. I'm going to change it to something different than what we've had in the past. So I've just changed it on Edwin. Edwin doesn't know what his new password is. We're going to say no, the user does not have to change password in the next logon. And click OK. All right, it's been changed. Now, let's go ahead and, well, before I close out of here, let me go into the properties of this account. If I go to the Account tab, you'll see here there's an option to unlock the account. Okay, but there's really no need because the account's not locked yet. I just want to show you that that's where it's going to be. But hang on, let's try this and see if this works. I'm going to close out of here. Let's log out. Now, we were currently logged in as the administrator, but we're going to try to log in as E. Bryant. So we're going to say switch user, and let's log in as E. Bryant. And I'm going to use the wrong password. Oh, wrong password. Let's try it again. Oh, wrong password. Let's try it a third time. No. Let's even try it a fourth time. You'll notice, by the way, the user doesn't realize that they're locked out, right? I'm doing a fifth time here. It just keeps saying username and password is incorrect. Even if I do the correct password now, right? Let's say Edwin Bryant says, "What's going on?" and finds out, "Oh, I've got a new password." Now I've done the correct password. And you'll notice what's happening here. Yeah, what's happening is that the user is getting to log on. Now, do you have a guess as to why that might be? Because I know why it is. It's because the group policy was done under computer configuration, and the computer configuration is only put into effect when the computer is rebooted. So let's try something here. Let's go ahead and run a GP update and go ahead and update the policy. And you'll see here in a moment it's going to say it updated the user policy. And in just another moment it'll say that the computer policy has been updated, and then the window's going to close. Oh, got a message there. You know what? Let's go ahead and let me show you what that message is. GP update. Okay, by going to an actual command prompt window and running GP update, what happens is it stays open so we can read what the messages are. Okay, so the user policy has been completed. And when it comes to the computer policy, says that it wasn't able to do this because we need to be able to do a reboot. Well, I'm pretty certain that that is because of the software policy that we put in place in the previous lesson. So let's go ahead and see if that's true. I'm going to go ahead and close this, and let's log off. And this time, let's go ahead and try logging in. Oh, Edwin forgot that it got changed, and he's out there trying his old password again. What is that password? I can't seem to remember it. Oh, look at that. The reference account is currently locked out and may not be logged onto. Even if I do the correct password, it's locked out. Edwin's going nowhere. So, what do we need to do? Well, we could sit around and wait 15 minutes. Or, what more likely would happen if Edwin was actually sitting at his computer, is he's going to go ahead and call into help desk and say, "Oh man, it says my account's locked out." So, I'm now logged in as administrator. I've taken this phone call from Edwin saying that his account is locked out. So let's go ahead and jump up here to Active Directory, Users and Computers. Here we have the Edwin Bryant account. If I go into the Properties and go to the Account tab, you see, now when it says Unlock Account, it says this account is currently locked out. If I want to unlock it, check that box, click OK, and the account is unlocked. Now before I do that, let me cancel out because I want to show you there's another way of unlocking the account. When Edwin's on the phone with help desk saying, hey, my account got locked out, the person on help desk might ask why. And if it is determined that Edwin has actually forgotten his password, sometimes the user will be like, oh, I was a knucklehead. My caps lock was on. I didn't even realize it, and I typed in the wrong password because of that. Okay, well, then there's no reason to have to reset the password. But if the user says, I can't even remember it. I'm trying what I thought it was. Well, then what we can do is right-click, reset password, change the user's password, and also unlock the user's account. Okay, these are the two different ways that we can unlock an account that's been locked out. All right, so that's how you set up password and account lockout policies using group policy. Now, the next thing I want to show you is something called fine-grained password policies. Okay, and this uses something called a password settings object. Now, I'm going to tell you that the process of doing this is really cool in the sense that we now can set up separate password policies for separate groups of users within a domain. But the downside to this is that it's not an overly intuitive interface. You have to really know what you're doing here. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to create another group. Okay? Because right now we have the sales security group. Let's create an IT security group. So let's say new group. And we're going to say IT admins. And we'll just say it's a global security group. And if I go to New York IT, you'll see here that if I were to go ahead and I'm going to click the first one, scroll down, hold down the Shift key, and click in the end to highlight them all. If I right click and say add to group, IT admins, check names, there we go. Okay, so these users are all now a part of this group. If I go into this group, members, there we go. Got a bunch of people in there. The reason I did that is because I want to set up a fine-grained password policy that makes it that the IT admins must have stronger password complexity than what the rest of the users have. So the way we do this is with a tool. Well, there's a few different things, but we're going to start off with a tool called ADSI Edit. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Start and go to Administrative Tools, and you will see here, even though I'm on a Windows 7 computer right now, right, I'm on the client computer, because I installed the remote server administration tools and I included the Active Directory utilities, it includes ADSI Edit. If you don't have it here, then you can always get it on a domain controller. But if I go ahead and right click and we want to run as an administrator, we want to make sure we're always running ADSI Edit with administrative credentials. We're going to go ahead, let me expand this. I'm going to take the ADSI Edit tool and I'm going to right click here and say Connect to, and we're just going to accept the defaults here of default naming context. Click OK. Because over here, I'm going to go ahead and click on the default naming context. And I'm actually going to expand it down. And I'm going to click on DC equals globalmantics, comma, DC equals local. Okay, do you know what that is? That's the LDAP distinguished name for the domain itself. Okay, so if I click on that and then expand that down, come down here and click on System, and then expand that down, and let's go ahead and let's move this over so we can see what we're looking at. Click on Password Settings Container. Now, as I mentioned earlier, again, this is not very intuitive. You have to know exactly how to do this. So what we're going to do is go ahead and right-click on the Password Settings Container. Okay, this is what actually holds our password settings objects. I'm going to select New Object. It's a password settings object. Click Next. First, we have to give this a name. So we could say like IT admins PSO. Right? It's the IT administrator's password settings object. Click Next. Now we need to give it a password settings precedence. Now what this pretty much has to do with is if there are more than one password settings objects that somehow relate to the same user, which by the way that is strongly recommended against doing, okay, you really should be careful with this, then it will go with the one that has the highest precedence. So we're just going to go ahead and leave it as 1. And actually, when I say the highest, 1 is the highest possible precedence. Okay, so we want this to take precedence over, let's say, like the default domain policy, and if there are other password settings objects with a higher number. Don't worry about this too much. The idea here is you shouldn't have a lot of these, and they should definitely be specific to individual users where there's not overlap, and you should just have a 1 put in that value every time. So let's go ahead and click on Next. Do we want to have reversible encryption? Well, of course we don't. So we're going to say false. Next. Password history length. These looking familiar, by the way? Now it's starting to look like the settings that we saw in group policy. Well, for history, we're going to go ahead and for IT administrators, we're going to remember the last 12 passwords. Click Next. For password complexity, yes, we do want to have complexity. So that's true. Click Next. For minimum password length, these are IT administrators. They're going to have 15-character passwords. As far as minimum password age, we're not real worried about our IT administrators going through and resetting passwords the way our users would. So I'm going to go ahead and just say 1 day is the minimum password age. And we can't just put a 1 in there. Okay? The way this is configured is you put 1:00:00:00:00, which stands for 1 day, 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. Let's go ahead and click Next. Now we have a maximum password age. Now because the IT administrator's passwords are so much more secure, and we trust our IT administrators to truly use good passwords, we're going to go ahead and put in a value of 60 days, 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. So administrators only have to reset their password once every 2 months, once every 60 days. Go ahead and click Next. It takes us right into our account lockout settings. So we have to give a lockout threshold. How many invalid attempts before we lock out the account? Well, I think 3 is still a good number, so we'll leave it at that. Next. Now this is called observation windows for lockout of user accounts. This has to do with the timer before we reset it and stop counting again. Okay, so this is how long before we reset the counter back down to 0. And we're going to go ahead and say if 3 invalid attempts are done within 0 days, 1 hour, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. So basically, if 3 invalid attempts are done within an hour, it gets locked out. And I'm going to click Next. And if it's been locked out, how long are we going to lock it out for? Well, how about we leave it locked out for an entire day? Which means odds are the administrator is going to go ask another administrator to unlock it, which means that it's really going to be, there's going to be a close look at what's going on with it. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and say 1 day is how long the account stays locked out once it's been locked out. Go ahead and click Next and Finish. And we now have a password settings object. Now, just because we have the object and just because we've called it IT admins PSO, it doesn't mean that it's going to affect the IT admins. We have to actually make that happen. So the way we're going to do that is by popping back over here into Active Directory, Users, and Computers. And then in here, we need to go into the system container. You see the system container? Yeah, I don't see it either. You know why that is? Because we have to go up to View, Advanced Features. Okay, anytime you're doing high-level stuff, they don't want it there by default where you might accidentally mess this up. So you have to turn on Advanced Features to see it. So if we click on the system container, and then over here, let me go ahead and move this over so we can see. We have the passwords settings container. and we'll actually double click it, or we could have expanded it and clicked on it over here. Either way is fine. But over here is where we see the IT admin's PSO. If we right click on this password settings object and go to properties, and by the way, before we go any further, let me just explain. ADSI edit is what we used to create a new Active Directory object. Okay, something that cannot be done through the regular GUI. Now the object's been created, we're managing that object through the regular GUI, just so you can kind of understand why we're in the different locations that we are. So here, we're in the properties of the IT admin's PSO, and we're going to go to the Attribute Editor tab. Here in the Attribute Editor tab, if I scroll down, and I need to go right down here to MSDS PSO applies to. Okay, again, even though we're back in the GUI, this stuff is not intuitive. You have to know exactly how to do this. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this and click Edit. And then we're going to add a Windows account. Now, we could also do this through a distinguished name, but we're going to do it through a Windows account. We're looking at users, computers, or groups. So let's go ahead and put in IT admin. I'll just put IT AD. Should be good enough. IT admins. Click OK. And then we can go ahead and click OK. And this is actually how, let me go ahead and click OK again here, you make this password settings object apply to a certain user, or in this case, group. Now, if we were to jump back over here to the New York OU and the New York IT, and then go to the properties of one of these users, and then go to the Attribute Editor tab for that user, and then we're going to filter and select constructed. We're going to create a constructed filter. We're going to come down here and go to MS resultant PSO. And if we take a look at that, what is the answer? The answer is that it's using the IT admin's PSO, the one that it's supposed to. Now, this would be another way, by the way, when it comes to that whole preference value, like if there were more than one PSO that might apply to a given user. So let's say that this particular user belonged to two different groups, each of which had its own PSO assigned to it. Well, then we would have to come in here and see what the resultant PSO is for that user. And it gets just kind of crazy. So now here's the thing. Let me go ahead and close some of this stuff up. And let's stop looking at advanced features because we don't need to look at that anymore. Here's what I want to tell you. What I want to tell you is when it comes to these fine-grained password and account lockout policies, it's super, super cool. But, as we just saw, out of everything that I've taught you so far in this course, this is the least intuitive item that we've gone over. But once you know how to do it, it can really come in handy, because who wants to create a separate domain for those IT administrators just because they got to have different passwords? Or what about a situation where the CEO of your company wants to have a very easy password, easier than what you allow for the rest of the users? You're going to put the CEO in a domain all by himself? Well, I got news for you. I've seen it done. I've seen a domain actually called the CEO's domain .companyname.local. It's done. Well, we don't have to do that anymore. So that's where it is super duper cool. Well, that brings us to the end of this lesson, where we started off by seeing how this affects global semantics. And quite honestly, it's how this affects pretty much any organization out there. If you have the need to put different password complexity requirements on different users, and you don't want to have to create a separate domain to satisfy that need, well, that's what we can do here in Windows Server 2008. We looked at the password policy, looked right down to all the details of the different settings, as well as the account lockout policy. I showed you how to use the default domain policy, or quite honestly, you could use any policy as long as it is linked to the domain. And that is the easy way, we could say, of doing it, right? Because we saw that creating a password settings object is not easy. It's also the older way of doing it, but still the current way of doing it in many cases, unless you have that need to separate out into different password policies, in which we can go ahead, and I showed you how to create a password settings object where you have to use the ADSI editor to go ahead and create the new object, and then you go back into Active Directory and you have to get into deep details and go into the attribute editors to go in and assign that password settings object to an individual user or group. All right. Well, that's all I got for you in this lesson. I will see you in the next one.